Hey all, welcome to a new fanfic here on Mystic Reads. Today, we have the Yajuu Sannin by ShredJeep777. I will leave the fanfic in the description below so you guys can follow along with me. While exploring the Team 7 training ground, a young Naruto happens to stumble across a strangely shaped kunai embedded in a tree. Years of frustration and deciphering later, he finally cracks the Fuinjutsu formula hidden along the handle with surprising and painful results. At the same time, a ghost of the Utsuchi sets in motion a plan to end his family's eternal conflict. Chapter 1. The Perfect Soldier. The Anbu knelt before the hokage awaiting his orders. Outside the hokage's face was a perfect mask. One he had built from years of experience that betrayed no trace of emotion or thoughts. Inside, he mentally sighed as he stared at the perfect soldier kneeling before him. "Thank you, Kitsune. Make sure to take at least a week of rest before returning for active duty." After a moment of silence, the Hokage followed up with, "And no, that was not a recommendation. It was an order. If you insist, Hokage-sama," Kitsune obediently replied. The Hokage had to resist the urge to shake his head at the near-mindless response. While he was an impeccable soldier, Kitsune was not what one would call a social person. For years, the old man had tried to coerce him into fraternizing with others his age, but he would be shot down. It saddened him to see someone whom he practically raised from a young boy become so alone. It still astounded him how vicious the boy had turned out. Even amongst other Anbu, who were considered the deadliest in the village, it was uncommon to take A rank after A rank missions, only pausing to take an occasional S rank. It truly was a shame Itachi had left so early. What they could have accomplished together would have been staggering. It felt like only yesterday when Hiruzen had stumbled upon the boy breaking into the Sarutobi complex. The Anbu would never have even noticed him if the Hokage hadn't headed down to the storage room for a late night snack. As he creaked open the door, the boy simply froze and did nothing but stare back at the surprised old man. The boy's face had been covered in dirt, and his clothes had been caked in dried mud. He was just a clanless orphan with nothing but the clothes on his body and thin scroll on his back. It was so silent that the old man could hear the boy's heart throbbing in his chest in fear. He had offered him a kind smile to put him at ease before walking towards him. The moment he moved, the boy dropped everything and turned to bolt from the scene. He barely made it 3 steps before he was stopped by the Anbu that followed the third Hokage at all times. The blonde-haired boy struggled to free his arms, and his thrashing only grew worse as the old man drew closer. The Hokage had knelt before him and offered him a smile before waving off the guards. The boy rubbed his wrist as he desperately tried to stare everywhere but into the old man's eyes. He was surprised when the man ruffled his hair and offered him the burlap stock of food he had dropped in his haste to escape. The boy could only stare dumbstruck with awe when the Hokage offered him a place to sleep. Ever since that night, that boy had clung to him at the hip as much as the Anbu would allow. He had immediately made a request to enlist as a shinobi, and the rest was history. All but adopted by the head of the Anbu at the time, he spent every waking moment of his time studying, training, and pushing his body to the limit in order to serve the man who had shown such kindness. He was precise, vicious, and had a mind as sharp as his blade. Yes, Anbu had crafted their perfect little monster. Yet, it saddened the old man to see such a level of commitment that prevented the boy from having his own life. "That will be all, Kitsune. You are dismissed," the Hokage sighed. Kitsune nodded and headed for the door. As he reached for the handle, the door slammed open, and in raced a blur of yellow and orange. "Hey, Gigi!" A smile crept across the old man's face as his other young charge sped towards him like a bolt of lightning. Equally as quick, Kitsune snatched up the young boy and held him by the collar of his shirt. "No fair, Fox Baka! Let me go!" The young boy cried out as he squirmed for release from the older boy's grasp. Their interactions never ceased to amuse the old man. No one else had the gall to insult Kitsune right to his face. "Naruto, please be more respectful to Kitsune. You know he is just doing his job. Besides, You wouldn't want to irritate him on accident. The lump of blonde hair crossed his arms and pouted. Like I care. He's not that great. If it wasn't for the fact that he's taller than me, I'd kick his ass. The masked boy had no response, but the old man could tell from his body language that he was smirking underneath his mask. Naruto seemed to be the only one that could elicit that kind of response from him. I'm sure, the old man responded with a smirk. Now Naruto, what are you doing here? If I'm not mistaken, classes have not been let out yet, and I'm sure Iruka would be disappointed to find out that you have been skipping again. The 8-year-old boy blushed and at least looked a little ashamed before replying. He's sick today, and some other Teme is teaching. He made me sit in the hall and wouldn't let me back in. I didn't do anything, Gigi, I promise. He wouldn't listen. A frown found its way across the third Hokage's face, as once again, another teacher at the academy acted out against the young boy. It had become a reoccurring theme over the past few months, no matter how much he threatened the staff of the academy. He couldn't just send Anbu agents to watch the class to keep them in line. Misuse of resources for personal reasons aside, it would be difficult to explain to clan heads why there were suddenly Anbu agents stationed around the classroom filled with so many other future heirs, when the teachers were supposed to be vetted for their protection already. It was starting to affect the boy's grades, and he knew it would only get worse. He inwardly shook his head at the fools that acted against the boy. If he were any other student, they would have been overjoyed to have such a studious child. One day, the young boy had wandered into his office out of boredom. The Hokage had been out in a meeting, but the blonde had found another way to entertain himself. When his meeting was finished, he's surprised to walk in and find the boy entrenched in one of the Fuinjutsu books he kept on his bookshelf. To say that he and his guards were on edge would be an understatement. It went without saying that watching a Jinchuriki meddle with Fuinjutsu was beyond stressful. When asked why he chose that particular book, the boy gazed up at him and simply replied, it was because the swirl symbol on the cover was the same one on all of his shirts. With that simple explanation, he and the guards stationed around the room had let out a sigh of relief. Sarutobi knew Naruto was not the kind of person to enjoy sitting still or reading. So, to keep the boy so calm and focused, on a book of all things, was nothing short of astonishing. After a short debate in his head, he had gladly lent the boy the book, and a week later, the boy returned asking for the next volume. This continued on, and now the boy was starting to exhaust the beginner Fuinjutsu books that he had kept in his office. The third Hokage stopped his trip down memory lane and turned his attention back to the young boy in front of him. I'm sorry to hear that, Naruto. Do you want Kitsune to go with you to talk with the teacher and to letting you back in? The boy shook his head vigorously. Nah, he's just a boring old coot anyway. I'd rather you teach me some awesome jutsu instead. Come on, Gigi, please? The old man chuckled as he replied, I'm sorry, Naruto, but I'm busy as it is, motioning to the mountain of paper that littered his desk and the ground around him. Maybe in a week or two we can schedule a day for just the two of us, or, at the very least, free up some time for some ramen. The young boy's eyes lit up in excitement, and his sound of approval echoed off the walls of the room. Kitsune, please escort Naruto back to the academy. And, while you're there, ensure that the teacher is aware of my displeasure of the situation. Over Naruto's sounds of disappointment, Kitsune nodded, understanding the message. And before you go back, maybe just show a little something to Naruto to appease his curiosity. Naruto perked up again. Do you mean it? Only if you promise to behave yourself until Iruka returns from his leave, replied the third Hokage with a serious expression. You got it, Gigi, and I never break a promise. Datebayo. He chuckled at the verbal tick as he waved Kitsune, who was still holding the boy by his collar, out of his office. He continued to hear the boy's muffled screams for release as they made their way down the hall. He sighed and leaned back into his chair. Naruto was always a breath of fresh air, and it was good for Kitsune to at least show some emotion. Naruto was someone who refused to be ignored and demanded attention. When Naruto had first met Kitsune, he refused to stop bugging the teenager about how his mask's whisker marks were similar to his own. After a nasty run with some drunk villagers, Kitsune had intervened on Naruto's behalf, and they had taken to each other immediately afterwards. As similar as the two were, Hiruzen reflected upon how they would follow different paths. Kitsune was a perfect example of what Naruto would have turned into had Danzo gotten his hands on him. A perfect, lethal, empty shell of a person with nothing but loyalty to the village. Naruto was too bright and cheerful for that. Hiruzen was content with his decision to keep the boy from starting his career too early. He already had the guilt of one child soldier on his conscience, and he didn't want to add another. He made one final gaze at the fourth picture hanging on his wall of a mop of golden hair before resigning himself back to the papers stacked in front of him. Chapter 2. A Chance Discovery. Naruto was so happy that he could almost skip as he made his way through Konoha. He would never actually skip. No, never. For that wasn't very shinobi-like. No sir. But he was so excited he couldn't help but at least giggle. He had finally done it. He had made his way through Jiji's library of beginner fuinjutsu books, and now he held a new blue book under his arm. He could finally start moving on to the advanced stuff. His mood slightly soured and he made a tiny pout. Well, not really advanced stuff. Jiji had said he still had to move on to the medium level books. But hey, that was still an improvement. His determination back in his eyes, he vowed to be the best ninja in the village at fuinjutsu, just like the fourth Hokage was before him. Though he would never admit it, Naruto was very self-conscious when it came to his own talent. Sure, he liked to talk big and would fight tooth and nail to back it up, but whenever he had to compare himself to the likes of Sasuke or even Kitsune, he would feel disappointed in his own ability. He would spend hours trying to mimic what Nichan and Kitsune-san would teach him, but he still felt as though he was coming up short. The fact he had advanced to his current level of fuinjutsu all by himself made him beam and swell with pride. He had become entranced the second he laid his eyes on that book in Jiji's office. He still didn't know what it was, but something about seals just clicked with him. It was exhilarating to finally find something he was good at. But when he learned in class that his hero, the fourth Hokage, was also a seal master, it was just even better. Naruto couldn't help but snicker at the memory of the teacher's face when Kitsune had arrived with him back at the academy a few weeks ago. He had never seen anyone's face turn that pale before. He had forgotten what kind of effect Kitsune's presence tended to have on other people. He always forgot how big of a deal he was due to the way he treated him. Kitsune would always take the time to listen to him, and he'd always rub his hair when he left. At first, it bugged him like it would any other kid, but he eventually grew fond of the sign of affection and looked forward to it, although he would never admit it. So, there he was, not skipping, clutching his fist, grade 2 fuinjutsu book under his arm. All the while ignoring the angry stares and whispers that would erupt as he passed by. It was the weekend, and Iruka had decided to cut the class some slack by not giving them any homework. Now, with all this free time, he made his way towards his second favorite spot in the village. It was too hot today to sit on the rocky head of the Hokage monument. Instead, he headed out towards the training grounds Kitsune had showed him once or twice. As he entered Training Ground 7, he headed off towards the opposite edge of the clearing, sheltered under the shade of the looming trees. He kept strolling until he finally found a place that satisfied him and popped a squat. Easing back against the roots, he excitedly tore open his new book. His excitement quickly bettered out when he saw nothing but a blank page. His eyebrows burrowed in confusion, and his heart started to sink as he skimmed through the rest of the book to find that all the pages were blank. What was going on? Jiji wouldn't just give him an empty book. He bet it was that new receptionist. She must have done something to switch to covers. But she had seemed so nice to him before. He turned back to the beginning and found a letter taped to the inside cover. Naruto peeled it off as easily as he could without damaging the book and proceeded to rip open the letter. He skimmed through the message before groaning and slumping back against the tree. Dear Naruto, I want to congratulate you for finally completing the beginner class series. I'm very proud of you and glad to see you're taking a more serious approach to your education. I apologize for not being able to give you your next volume in person. I am needed in a meeting with the Fire Daimyo in the capital for the next week, so Kitsune and I will be unable to congratulate you on your accomplishment in person. Kitsune is also proud of you in his own way, I took his grunt when I mentioned your accomplishment as a sign of approval. By now, you're probably wondering why your current book is blank. Consider it a test. I don't claim to be an expert seal master, but I like to think that I know my way around the trade. I do know that all seal masters go through a series of tests upon completing each level, and since Konoha is rather lacking in that department, I thought I'd give you a mock test until a true expert can come to test your abilities. Your challenge is simply to unlock your new book. All you have to do is remove the seal from the first page. Think of it as a accumulation of everything you have learned so far. Before you get any ideas in that empty head of yours, don't think about simply tearing the page with the test on it. All that will do is activate a security seal and spit out an enormous amount of ink, drenching both you and the book's pages. I know you can crack this if you put your head to it. Good luck, and I will see you soon. Here is in Sarutobi. Naruto was filled with a strange combination of annoyance and anticipation. While he was ticked that the old man tricked him, he was also humbled that the old man thought enough of him that he could pass this test. However, a grim realization settled over him as he realized he hadn't brought his sealing kit with him. Kuso, he muttered as he slumped against the tree. He had only been planning to flip through the book and get a hold of the new concepts before starting to take any notes. He hadn't thought to bring his equipment with him. The seal Gigi had placed was only slightly challenging. For his classmates, they would have mistaken the massive ink blots and symbols as unreadable jargon. But to him, it was as clear as day. The big seal on the page was split into 3 parts. The outside of the sphere was a double detection seal that activated whenever the book was opened. This meant that every time he opened the cover, the seal would recognize it and activate the other seals below it. The second part was a quadruple seal split up into 4 parts. One to detect any tear in the page, another acting as a storage seal most likely filled with ink, yet another that would propel whatever was in the storage seal outwards, and a final part that prevented working on the lower level anti-theft seal until the others were taken care of. The final level was the anti-theft seal, which hid all the ink from the pages of the book. It also had a timed alarm that would activate the moment someone started working on breaking down the seals. All in all, not too challenging for him, but not exactly a walk in the park. This would take time, concentration, and all of his equipment, which he had left at home. Not resigned to lose his day in the training grounds, he tucked the book under his arm and neatly folded the letter into his pocket before setting off into the woods. Naruto loved to explore, although the Anbu would never let him when he was little. He understood why they wouldn't let him go. You can't just let a toddler wander off all by himself. But his stubborn attitude never let him give up that desire to just see what's out there. The first time he had come here, he had been so excited to discover the multitude of used kunai and shuriken that littered the training ground. When he ventured deeper into the forest, he would only discover more and more kunai lodged into the branches of trees and burn marks left over from the fire techniques cast long ago. Naruto had already scavenged most of the stuff left around. He didn't particularly like using partially damaged tools, but it wasn't exactly a choice. With the prices that the shop owners were charging him, it was better to resort to the supplies he would find in the training grounds. Today, Naruto found himself traveling further and further into the woods than he usually went, hoping to find some kunai or shuriken that he may have missed before. After about 45 minutes of walking with no results, he was ready to turn back and head home to unlock his new book. As he turned to leave, a glint of sunlight caught his eye. Up in a tree off to his right, he could make out the metallic gleam of a kunai's handle. Naruto smiled to himself as he set his book down and began clambering up the thick trunk. He slowly inched himself up the bark until he could finally stand on the wide branch and get a good look at it. The blade was buried hilt deep inside the bark. Naruto took off the handle, which was bigger in comparison to the other kunai he had used, and pulled with all his might. After 3 or 4 tugs, he finally managed to yank out the blade to only discover something different. The hell is this? The blade wasn't shaped like normal kunai. It seemed to have 3 prongs that shot out from the handle. Speaking of which, he had never held a kunai with such a bulky handle. Aw man, the thing must be broken. He pouted to himself and got ready to chuck it away, until he caught sight of something on the handle. Naruto was no expert, but he certainly recognized an advanced formula when he saw one. He ran his hand along the handle, rubbing over the complex formula he had never seen before. His eyes darted over the kanji, and he couldn't make heads or tails of it. With his limited knowledge, he could only pick up bits and pieces of it. This was more advanced than anything he had seen in his books. It was something unknown, and that sent an exhilarating chill down his spine. Now this was what he considered a challenge. While Gigi's seal was complicated for an average beginner, he would have solved it within 15 minutes. Maybe 10 if he was really pushed. That would be a breeze, considering the security seal was timed to collapse after an hour. This was something new, and it could possibly take him years to figure it out. Never one to back down from a challenge, he tossed the kunai in the air, liking the way it felt compared to the others. Before making up his mind, a big grin found its way across his face as he slowly made his way back down the tree. He picked up his book and started to make his way back to the village, his eyes never leaving the mysterious formula on the weird kunai. Chapter 3. First Steps. 2 years later, the blonde 10-year-old sat in the middle of the clearing, moving with as much precision as he could muster. Slowly and painfully, he weaved and flicked his brush across the parchment, leaving smooth, clean strokes in its wake. He brought his arm down for the final stroke and slowly began to draw the final kanji, all the while pumping as steady a stream of chakra as he could manage. Finally, he finished and gazed upon his work, letting out a sigh of relief. A smile erupted on his face. He opened his mouth to shout, "Yatta!" only for the seal to explode in his face, sending him skidding back several yards. "Ow," was all the boy could groan as he tried to sit up. The entire front of his body stung, and his goggles were clouded with soot. He tried to clean them with the back of his hands as he mentally reprimanded himself. He had left the tip of his brush on the page. When he had grown excited, a surge of chakra had ran through his body, and, by extension, through the brush and into the seal, setting it off. He muttered a curse as he dragged his aching body out of the clearing towards the cool shade of the tree line. He leaned back against the tree and winced as he inspected the damage. His hands were bright red, and several blisters were already forming. Could have been worse. He cringed as he remembered the first time he had attempted to make an exploding tag. Of course, he had set it way higher than he should have for a first attempt. The front of his shirt had been burned away, and the flesh on his hands and chest had been completely seared off. That had been a very unpleasant day at the hospital due to his aching body and the scolding he received from the Hokage. Kitsune had dropped by and gave him his signature silent scolding, which was even worse. His aura and stare had made him feel even guiltier than when Iruka had come by. Seeing now as a good time as any, he decided to call a break, at least until his hand stopped feeling like he had grasped a piece of hot metal. He closed his eyes and relished the feeling of the wind racing across his face. He sure was growing more and more busy lately. He barely had any time to appreciate the tiny moments like this. There was just so much he had to do. He had to keep up his pace with his Fuinjutsu studies. By now, he was about halfway through the medium class books. He also had to keep on top of the lessons that Kitsune and Nichan had taught him. Then, he had his own secret projects, which took up most of his time and were extremely difficult. He had one project set aside to help Nichan with her own special problem, and another working out the secret of his mystery kunai that he had found in the woods. He absent-mindedly took said kunai out of his pocket and gazed at the handle for what seemed to be like the millionth time. He had made a lot of progress deciphering it. Well, a lot of progress for a beginner anyways. He had known the thing was complicated when he had first found it, but now that he was halfway through the middle class, he was starting to truly grasp the complexity of the seal formula. When he first started it, it was all just a complicated mess that made his head spin. So he did what Kitsune had taught him to do when faced with the problem. Break it down and solve it by parts. After using a copy seal and expanding the formula onto a larger sheet, he was dumbfounded by the complexity of it. He had barely made his way through 1/4 of the seal, and it still barely made any sense. All he had been able to decipher so far was that it had something to do with an equal exchange of matter and energy. He would have mistaken it for a storage seal if it weren't for the lack of the clear indicators found in all storage seals, no matter what their size. That, plus how dense and complicated the formula was, led him to believe that it had to be something more. However, his grades had started to take a serious dip due to his free time being spent on his own progress. His bunshin was still a mess, and no matter what he did, he just couldn't get it. However, this only made him more determined to show off all that he could with his fuinjutsu during the exam so that they would overlook his poor bunshin. Not getting anywhere unraveling the mystery of the weird kunai, he sighed and tucked it back in his bag before opening his latest book and waiting for his hands to heal. Near the back west corner of the Hyuga clan's compound was the clan's library. It was a building that towered over the rest of the complex with multiple levels above and below ground. The first level contained a brightly lit reading area with basic information and resources for anyone in the clan to access. The floor below it was designated specifically for the branch members. While branch members and main family could both access this level, the one directly below it was strictly reserved for the main house families. Below that level was an even smaller level reserved only for main family members who were directly related to the head of the clan. In the back corner of the first floor sat a young lavender-eyed girl. She was snuggled into a cushion of pillows, poring over yet another story regarding the triumph of the main house over another clan during the times before the hidden villages. Hinata loved reading. When she was younger, her mother would read to her for hours on end. Her soothing voice would always put her at ease and lull her to sleep. She loved this spot due to its quiet atmosphere and distance away from most of the compound. Whenever she got upset or was disappointed in herself, she would retreat within the walls of the library and sped through book after book to ignore the pain. While most of the library's contents involved Jyokin techniques and clan history, there were also poems and stories crafted by members of the clan. She loved the poetry from the branch house section especially. They were filled with such passion and emotion that was rare to see up front within the clan's walls. They also made her sad, as they were yet another reminder of the harsh divide the cage bird seal was causing the family. Closing another embellished story of a Hyuga victory, the 10-year-old girl made her way back down to the second level to return it to its spot. Today, the library was mostly empty. It was growing later into the evening, and people had mostly trickled out. She enjoyed staying for as long as the librarian would allow her before she would be forced to return to the house. She ran her hand along the wooden bookshelves as she walked down the aisle where she had picked up her book. Finding its spot, she happily sat it back in place and turned to leave. As she started heading towards the stairs, she felt a cold chill flow down her spine. She whipped around, scanning the room for anyone else. She started to tremble, as no one was in sight. She could have sworn she had heard a whisper, and it had been uncomfortably close to her. Hand shaking, she forced herself to make a seal and activate her Byakugan. The world melted away into black and white as she peered through the bookshelves. Sure enough, the entire floor was empty. The only person lingering in the building was still the librarian sitting at her desk stamping at paperwork. Her head was telling her to rush up the stairs, but her feet were planted firmly in place. She felt a slight tug in her gut, and she slowly started walking deeper into the room. She kept going deeper and deeper, until she found herself standing at the gated entrance to the third sublevel, which was reserved only for the direct family of the clan head. Her whole body was shaking and wanted to flee, but she stilled herself and thought of an adventurous young blonde before steeling her resolve. As she passed through the gate, her hand passed over the seal designated to detect and activate the cage bird seal, and her hand unconsciously went to her forehead. She grabbed a candle from the wall, and it lit with the low-level fire jutsu. Nothing special, just something taught at the academy to help light fires on missions. She descended down the stairway and creaked open the wooden door to the bottom floor. This was honestly the first time she had ever ventured down here, and she was surprised by how small it was compared to the rest of the building. Even though she had access to it, she had never felt like coming down here. The atmosphere it exuded just reminded her too much of a console. There were fewer scrolls on this floor, but they were still neatly organized and piled on what few shelves there were. The room was filled with secrets and restricted Juokin techniques known only to the clan heads and unedited versions of the clan's history. As she ventured through the shelves, she caught sight of a rather large scroll sitting at a pedestal. Unlike many of the other scrolls down here, this one was absent of cobwebs and dust. There were very few people with access to this floor, and none of them would have come here with cleaning on their mind. That would be below their station. To see one in such clean condition shocked her. She ran her fingertip along the kanji for tiger as she felt the same chill from before. She whipped her head around and happened to glimpse the faintest glow disappear behind a wooden door at the end of the room. She tentatively tiptoed inch by inch to the door. She reached out with her shaking fingers and touched the door handle. Hinata. Her back slammed against the door and her Byakugan flared the life, darting all across the room. Nothing. Still nothing. Her heart was beating in overtime and every instinct was telling her to run. But she slowly suppressed that feeling and deactivated her eyes. She was going to keep going. She just had this strange obligation to continue. Taking a deep breath, she creaked open the door and peeked inside. Even when she poked her candle through the doorway, she could barely see anything. She creeped down the stone hallway before entering a small round room. It was pitch black and the air felt cold and damp. She glanced up towards the ceiling and was surprised she couldn't see it. Lifting her candle as high as she could, it barely illuminated the walls of the room. She lowered the candle with care and skipped a little to the sides as hot wax dripped down its side. As she tilted the candle to drip off the rest of the melted wax, she made her way towards the walls. When it finally came into view, she was surprised to discover a white rock with strange engravings. She ran her hand through one of the grooves and started walking to her right. She followed the circular path of the walls and was surprised to discover something that the strange stone encompassed the entire room aside from the doorway. It rose up 2 feet above her head, and she faintly made out faded outlines of something on the walls. As she glanced back at the ground, she noticed a spot in the center where the sand had been disturbed. It looked as if someone or many people had stood in that exact spot. She hesitantly walked towards the center and faced the wall opposite of the hallway. Slowly, she raised her hand due to some unknown urge and activated her Byakugan. In an instant, the entire room was visible and it overwhelmed her. The rock wall seemed to light up, and the previously illegible markings bombarded her with information, most of which she didn't understand. The walls above the rocks depicted ancient murals and paintings of people resembling the Hyuga praying and guarding over a large white circle in the sky. Her mind was swirling with phases and images, most of which she couldn't comprehend. Even in her stupor, she was able to catch 1 or 2 phrases from the wall, such as the will of the moon people and their duty to guard. Hinata was confused and fascinated at the same time. This was unlike anything she had ever seen. It was beautiful. It was exhilarating. It was terrifying. She froze when she finally noticed that she was no longer the only one in the room. She slowly turned around to see a white, blurred figure standing in the exit of the hallway. Her breath was caught in her throat, and she began walking away from the figure. With every step she took away from it, it grew closer. She felt her back against the stone wall, and she curled up into a ball. The blurry horned figure made incomprehensible sounds as it moved towards her. She closed her eyes and covered her ears, as she only picked up bits and pieces. Tears stung her face as she shook in fear. "Help! Please! Please leave me alone!" "Hinata!" Her eyes shot open, and her father stormed into the room, straight through the figure, dispelling it. He crouched down in front of her, and she flung herself onto him. He winced at how tight she was gripping his neck as he placed her arms around her back. She was vigorously shaking and muttering something about a ghost. Hisashi had been beyond shocked. Earlier, he had been meaning to talk to Hinata regarding her training. When he discovered no one in the compound knew where she was, usually this just meant she was holed up in the library. But when he arrived, he couldn't find her anywhere. As others helped him search, he had activated his Byakugan to discover a major swell of chakra emanating from the main family's secret room. The amount of chakra radiating from the room was almost blinding. He forced himself through it and managed to see the outline of his daughter standing in the middle of the room. He raced through the levels of the library and tore across the final floor to see his daughter curled on the floor, crying out for help. He himself had stood in this room attempting to decipher the Hyuga ring to no avail, as had every clan head before him. In all of his research and personal experience, he had never seen or heard of anything like this happening before. Away from the eyes of the elders and the rest of the clan, Hisashi took a rare moment and let his emotions show, as he held his daughter in his arms and tried to calm her. He ran his hand down her hair and back in an attempt to calm her down. It had been years since he had carried her like this. He stood up from the ground and slowly started taking her back out of the chamber. It would be weeks before Hinata would find the courage to return to the library, and a whole year before she was willing to go back down to that level by herself. As her father carried her away, Hinata squeezed his arms and buried her face in his shoulder. It would not be until the next morning that she would discover the small scroll deciphered in her hand. The few words she had comprehended from the figure echoed in her mind. This is just the beginning. Steel yourself. Your first steps must be taken at your own pace.